Hello, my name is Reinekke Lengelle. I am a professor at Athabasca University, assistant professor of interdisciplinary studies, and I'm a researcher at The Hague University in the Netherlands. I have written a book recently called Writing the Self in Bereavement, a Story of Love, Spousal Loss, and Resilience. It will be published with Routledge in early 2021. And in the book, I use therapeutic writing to go through grief and loss myself. I lost my spouse in November 2018. His name was Frans Meyers, and he was my research and my work and life partner. So I would like to speak about the dialogical self and the way that I use dialogical self in my grief process and conceptualizing identity changes as I went through grief. So this is part 2. Part 1 was about continuing bonds and the dialogical self, therapeutic writing, and writing in bereavement. And this is part 2. Part 2 is, who am I now? That's the question I asked. And I found a very evocative quote in one of the grief books that I researched. It was by Jeffrey Berman, and he had written a book called Writing the Widowed. Writing Widowhood. Writing Widowhood is the title of the book. And in it, he had a wonderful quote at the beginning of the book, which really spoke to me as I first read it. But upon further investigation, the quote actually didn't resonate. And the dialogical self actually explained to me why that really was. So I will read a little portion of the book that's coming out on that aspect, and starting with the Rosenblatt quote that Jeffrey Berman used in his book, Writing Widowhood. So the quote is, people in grief become more like themselves. I'm going to repeat it. People in grief become more like themselves. It sounds very plausible. When you hear that statement, you think, yes, because they have no energy for being anybody else. Of course, you're going to really see their face because their defense is going to be down and all of those things. But on second thought, I think people in grief don't necessarily become more of themselves, but more of their selves are actually, you can become more aware of the many selves that you are in grief if you are willing to observe. And we are as the Dutch say, a vat vol tegenstrijdigheden. So we're actually a vat full of contradictions. That's actually our identity. And the dialogical self beautifully says that in the definition of the self in the theory, which is a dynamic multiplicity of I positions or voices in the landscape of the mind. Quoting here Hubert Hermans, the founder of the dialogical self theory. So I'm going to read a piece of my book on this aspect. Have I become more like myself in the wake of my spouse's death, or have a number of other things happened that are interesting to note? So here I go again. People in grief become more like themselves is a quote by bereaved author Roger Rosenblatt, who lost his daughter to heart failure. His words appear in the inside cover as a single quote, introducing Berman's book on writing, widows writing grief. The idea sounds intriguing and even intuitively correct. After all, would those grieving have the energy for anything else? Is this not a chance in life to drop all pretense? This idea about the self, however, assumes a kind of individual, knowable, and consistent self that is somehow laid bare by bereavement. Berman later uses the quote in a passage about widow writer Joyce Carol Oates and how her works of fiction prepared her for her husband's death, and that she grieves true to her character, quietly grief-stricken, but spiritually comforted. As I reflect more on this interesting phrase, which I find myself wanting to believe, I became increasingly doubtful about its veracity. I too grieve as I live, meaning I write poetry, I study grief, but that does not mean I am more like myself. Who is this self? Was I less myself before Frans's death? How might I conceptualize identity in a way that helps explain what is happening to the me in the wake of my spouse's death? In my experience, various aspects of myself are engaged in grief, and I see this variety of voices and perspectives as part of my resilience. Example, the poet, the practical woman, the academic, the emotive griever. I am not a singular I, in fact. I am more like the river Greek philosopher Heraclitus describes. I am at once the same river, feeling a familiar sense of self, but never the same river, continually in flow and experiencing new and different things as I listen to the myriad thoughts and positions within the self. We might say the words, I am more like myself, but there is no singular self we can actually point to. After a loved one has died, our identity may change in a number of ways. For instance, we may feel acutely the loss of a role that we had, for instance, wife or spouse, partner, and say that we are no longer who we thought we were. The death of a spouse may also mean the parts of us die off. For instance, the part of me that talked about career guidance theory daily. Franz was a career theorist, and I'm a writing the self expert, and we talked about career guidance daily, and now I talk about it perhaps weekly. We may also experience a return to an old self we identify with that was less present in the relationship. For instance, in my case, the girl who loves 80s music. Franz was born in the 50s, 1950, and I was born in 1970. And so we had a very different youth culture. And now that he has passed, I notice that I have listened to my own music more often. In that sense, more like myself. But could it be just as true that people in grief are less like themselves? Or even people in grief are more extreme versions of themselves? Or people in grief are a new combination of themselves? There is evidence to argue for any of these statements, and it is no coincidence that I write themselves, as it seems there are many parts of us engaged in life's conversation, not just a single me. When I turn Rosenblatt's idea around and play with it a little more, I see it's just as fair to say that I have become more like Franz. Well, how does this apply? While before he supported me as a living spouse, he is now internalized as a kind of I as Franz still speaking to me. It's as if I'm free to access and even take on some of his positive traits and strengths when I need to. For instance, I tend to worry less than I used to. He taught me by example the futility of worrying. Franz also asked himself every day, what can I learn from this, especially in situations of difficulty? And I find this question is second nature to me now, while before it sounded preachy and overly rational, and I resisted adopting his language. Similarly, my colleague and friend, also widowed, writes, I also appreciated the part where you spoke of internalizing Franz, incorporating him into your very being. A counselor shared that idea with me soon after Jerry died, when I wasn't sure I could take on all of his various roles in our home and family. She told me that I'd served a long apprenticeship and I could now use what I'd learned. That was my colleague Roberta No, who talked about her deceased spouse Jerry and all the tasks she had to take on. She became more like Jerry in her ability to deal with many of the practical things. Again, it seems we are not a singular, stable self, but a multi-voiced, somewhat integrated collection where we can even borrow from the selves of others. Some of our I positions may become more dominant in grief, and some may recede into the background. In the end, the new combination of selves we live out in response to loss may feel comfortingly familiar and wildly different at the same time. So I conceptualize these identity changes using the Dialogical Self Theory, developed by Hubert Hermans. This theory, developed by him and some colleagues many years ago, conceptualizes, again, the self as this dynamic multiplicity of I positions. DST, Dialogical Self Theory, can, for instance, help explain why in this book there are narratives the book that I've written, the narratives, scholarly reflections, dialogues, and poetry written by the same person, each I position emphasizing something different. The I as poet position stays close to feelings and creates salient vignettes of experience. The I as academic sheds light on how my grief is quite predictable and normal and allows me to compare myself with what is known about grief. The storyteller wants to remember and honor Franz and invites the reader to become a witness. The creator of dialogues builds a conversational bridge to the I as Franz position and allows the experience of a continuing bond. So, in exploring questions of what is happening to my identity in widowhood and going back to Rosenblatt's idea, I ask myself, how have I become more like myself? Or rather, which part of me has become more dominant or resonant since Franz's death? As I mentioned before, I have not raised my voice to anyone since Franz died, and I could say, this sure feels more like me, as I don't like to raise my voice to anyone. That said, when I felt trespassed upon and Franz and I argued, I did raise my voice, and that too felt like authentically me, as this voice represented a need for fairness and justice. Are there other me's or I positions that I would identify with as more like myself or that I would like to bring forward more? As I have said, I've returned to my own generation's music and now plan my own projects, my own writing and research projects. However, I still listen to Franz's choir music with pleasure and do research in the way that Franz and I did. I have been permanently shaped by having had a spouse who was a social scientist, a researcher, a teacher, a writer, a singer, and a sociologist hippie. I am not more like myself in grief, but more interested in what selves are emerging and what selves I would like to enact more and which I positions I don't need as much or prefer not to embody. There are a number of I positions that seem to be most necessary as I grieve and compose a new life. I seem naturally drawn to them. They provide both comfort and perspective. Recently in my journal, I drew a bird's eye view of a table and who is sitting around it. Which selves or I positions are part of my healing? It is not a boardroom table, but rather a kind of high tea put on by the Women's Auxiliary. It seems these characters have been responsible for getting me through at least the first year and year and a half of losing Franz. Imagine these dialogical I positions, all these I positions at this table in service of me going through grief. And me is also subdivided here, as you will tell from this what sketch I'm showing here. So at the head of the table is the observer, which is what in dialogical self theory is called the meta position. It is able to observe all the other positions and make new combinations. At the other head of the table is the wise woman, and close beside her, I as mourning. The wise woman is a combination of awareness, empowerment, and practicality. Her influence is a kind of promoter position. In fact, she chairs the committee of my wellness and self-change. Promoter positions are those positions that operate as innovators, imply a considerable openness toward the future, and have the capacity of organizing and producing a diverse range of more specialized positions. They give a sense of direction to the self, and in this way provide a compass function. One of her strengths is the ability to accept shadow positions that also sit at the table from time to time, like I as angry in grief, I as ashamed. A bit further down the table, there is I as poet, and sometimes perched on a wide window ledge nearby. This poet is writing prolifically and paying careful attention. I as poet is like the photographer of important moments. In the middle of the long rectangular table is the academic researcher of grief and her twin sister librarian, staring often into databases and looking absent but keeping track of which grief resources I might need next. And then there is the health advisor who says things like, today she must walk again, and please note a person gets better rest in the hours between 10 p.m. and midnight. I, as corresponder, is also taking notes and deciding with external positions, will be required to learn more and to give I, as writer, a bit of help with the process of writing a book. There's also a kind of housekeeper who cleans around the table and serves fresh nourishment. She's sort of the mental housekeeper of this party. There are also, as I was writing this book, there are also other internalized I positions that are also at this table. Very clearly, I as Franz is present. He sometimes gets up and leaves his chair, but the moment there is a need to speak with him, he sits down again and waits receptively. Yes, my love, tell me what you need. There are also close friends who add their wise words or are silent, compassionate witnesses. My experience here is reflected in the Dialogical Self Theory's quote here. Some I positions are more central, others are more peripheral, some are more cognitive, others more emotional or somatic, some are hierarchically higher and thus implicating a lot of different but related I positions, others are more narrow in their impact, quoting Konopka, Hermans, and Goglavis, 2019. So while editing this book, I shared individual sections with a handful of readers, in particular Roberta No, Carolyn Ellis, my editor, friend Andrea Hankinson, and colleague and friend Bob Niemeyer. And as I typed a section imagining one of them reading, I positioned myself for a moment as I as Roberta or I as Bob. And this helped me shape the text, even on the rare occasion that they weren't able to read or respond. So dialogically, they became extensions of myself and in conversation with me. So to conclude, the Dialogical Self Theory helped me conceptualize the many aspects within and without parts of me that really became resources. And as my book title, Writing the Self in Bereavement, a story of love, spousal loss, and resilience says, that there's a resilience to being able to access the many positions and to be able to reflect on the positions you see through the meta position, and also notice a voice of support and openness to the future, which was the promoter position, and in this case, the wise woman at the end of the table, the collection of positions. So it's wonderful to note that we are not 1 in a million, but we are 1,000,001. And in that sense, we're supported with this vast creativity of inner positions that help us through grief. We are not alone in grief. And interestingly, as we enhance that internal conversation through writing, which I did through therapeutic writing, we're able to articulate better what we need and also reach out to others. So the idea of writing the self in bereavement is not about doing an isolated activity of solving things yourself or going only having the internal dialogue. The external dialogue is vital to how we get through grief. And I have had so many friends and colleagues supporting me and affirming my process as I went through. So I hope this has inspired watchers and listeners, and that there is some inspiration here if you experience grief yourself. And there are ways to use writing to access such a wide variety of our internal richness. Thank you. My name is Reinekke Lengelle, and my book is Writing the Self in Bereavement, to be published with Routledge in 2021.